Welcome guys, it's Connor McDonough and Victor Pina here, and we're going to be explaining to you about working the land population explosion parts of the book, allowing you to study for the test that's going to be coming up this Monday. And without further ado, we're going to be off right now. So, first off, generally you want to know that the big ideas or the essential questions you're going to want to ask yourself in this presentation is how agriculture was like before the Agrarian Revolution. It's also known as the Agricultural Revolution for those who are less informed. How these changes were brought to agriculture and by whom. This is really just one group of people, and there's only one person in particular you have to remember about, so it's probably not going to be that much for you to remember, but keep those in mind. And what were some of the after effects of the improvements to farming, and this definitely expands beyond the farmstead. So keeping that in mind, we're going to be going down to the beginning, where at the end of the 17th century, the European economy was primarily about farming, since it's one of the biggest employments for most people at the time. I think if I recall in your book, it says that about 80% of all the people in Europe, that one of their primary professions was agriculture. Now, many of the locations in Europe, you're going to be thinking places like England here, where the geography is rather very hilly. Climates generally in the cold area, so generally many of the locations in Europe were unsuitable for farming. I mean, you do have the southern regions like Italy where farming was a really big thing. It was very effective, it was very efficient, but this wasn't the case in many places in the north. So due to this, a lot of people had very unbalanced diets, and through this malnourishment, they were very susceptible to disease. So this is pretty much how the Black Plague was spread, as you read back in your chapter about the Middle Ages. Other diseases include influenza or even smallpox in some cases. Now, before the agricultural revolution, most farmers used this thing called the open field system, which were basically large fields that were turned into long, narrow strips that weren't really enclosed during their time. Many of the peasants from the village would come in, work on the fields together as a village, like as a village-sized group, and they would go back. So it was basically almost what you can say it was like a public terminal for farming. Later on, they would also use this other thing called the 3-year system. This allowed for cash crops to be produced about 2 to 3 times per 3 years. One year might have a different crop that needs to be grown because the soil isn't doing well, because the one problem with the open field system was that it was very easy for the soil to be exhausted from the amount of work peasants were putting in, and this would usually lead to famine. And my friend Victor is going to be going over the ill effects of famine, which you can probably figure out at this point, but still, with the 3-year system, it allowed for the soil to be somewhat supplied with nutrients and the vitamins it needs in order to survive, but for the most part, you won't see that sort of stuff until later with the agricultural revolution, which is actually known as the crop rotation system. This was developed early on during the agricultural revolution, and basically what it did was certain crops would be rotated in order to figure stuff out. So say for instance one year you figured, hey, let's grow wheat as well as rye, and then that way next year we can grow maybe beans. So that way we're not necessarily using the same crop over and over and over again, but we're using different crops, so that could potentially supply different vitamins and such. And another technique that was used at the time was using different points of the land in order to farm over time. So you're not using the same piece of land over and over again, and then that way, you know, it has time to rejuvenate its natural batteries and it can get back to the farming. Now, that's basically the way they did that is through enclosures, which I'll be explaining in just a minute. But importantly, what you need to know is, since there were more vegetables being produced, since people were rotating crops and such, that means more animals were allowed to live, and they had more livestock. So that means more meat, more livestock for stuff like using to plow the fields, in the case of like oxen, maybe later horses. Now, on the enclosures, the way most farmers went through the agricultural revolution is that they usually farmed on these small things called enclosures, which were usually little pieces of land bought out by wealthy landowners that would be usually experimented on, they were usually fenced off. Now, this was good in terms of experimentation and allowing for one person to really expand on their farming techniques and such, but this was actually really bad for the peasantry, which I'll be getting to again in a minute. I usually say that, but don't worry, there's always an explanation for anything. Now, most of these new methods come from the Low Countries. This is basically overall the one country you really need to remember from the Low Countries is Holland. Now, the reason for Holland in particular is because Holland had a very large population, and since you have a very large population, you're going to have a lot of pressure to feed all of those mouths. So what over time, the Dutch worked on agricultural techniques in order to feed those people, because at the time Holland was expanding very far and wide, and what they needed to do is, as I said before, they needed to feed them. So through these revolutions in agriculture, they were able to develop better ways of creating more vegetables to provide for more people, and it's through this way that they were able to get more food for more people and creating these surpluses that they were actually able to feed larger and larger masses. So now, while Holland was one of the places where this really expanded, it was actually England that would really use these methods overall. None of the other countries really got into it. Now, England was one of the best in learning stuff about, certain things. In particular, the book goes over about drainage and water control from a guy called Cornelius Vermuyden. And in fact, he actually led a project near Cambridge to claim a large chunk of land in England that used to be swampy, turn it into neat farmland that could be used in England, and he actually succeeded with this. So England would take a lot of these ideals into account, whether it's from Vermuyden or from someone else. Now, one Englishman in particular, though, who's known as Jethro Tull, not the rock star from the 70s and 80s pictured below, but the guy on the left, with his nice powdered wig and everything, Jethro Tull used this thing called empirical reasoning, which may sound familiar if you did pretty well on your Enlightenment test. He used empirical reasoning and research to figure out better ways at farming. Now, this allowed him to figure out certain things, such as figuring horses were actually better to plow the fields instead of oxen, or even his idea that seeds should be sowed instead of, just all over the place from random people. It should be sowed with this special kind of drilling equipment that allows it to be sown into the dirt at a certain depth and at an equal spacing. Now, in the meantime of this, some of the Englishmen were also getting into selective breeding. Now, this is primarily at first with horses, because one of the higher aristocrat Englishmen's activities include horse riding as well as fox hunting, which is, you're going to be hunting on horses because you're rich and you don't want to walk because you're rich and you're fat. So, through selective breeding, through horses, farmers eventually figured they can do the same thing with their livestock, and they did. And this allowed them to get more meat, get better livestock to work with in the fields, like horses in Jethro Tull's case. Now, the effects through this is by the 1870s, overall agricultural production was up in England 300% higher than it was in the 1700s, which is pretty funny because the amount of farmers that were actually working, the percentage of farmers working only went up 14%. So obviously they're getting a lot more bang for their buck at this point. The only problem with all these improvements and all of these good developments is that while you have a lot of benefits, you're also going to have a few liabilities, of course, because with anything, you're always going to have a few setbacks. And in this case, in England in particular, with the enclosures, since Parliament figured this is good, we should totally do this a lot more, they decided to enclose most of the remaining common land at least by 1815 for wealthy landowners to take over and do their own thing with farming. Now, the problem with this is that while the rich are getting that opportunity, the poor are literally getting their land taken away because, don't forget, they used the open field farming system where it was almost like a public terminal. Well, now this is being privatized pretty much, and that farmland's going away, and the peasantry really has nothing to do. And what this is called is proletarization, which is basically almost the equivalent of us losing our jobs these days to like machinery or such. Except in this case, instead of losing our jobs to other thing, our jobs simply go away because the work environments just disappear entirely because the rich are buying out all the land, and the poor who used to own maybe little bits of land here and there really don't have any more land to work with. So there's a heavy unemployment in Parliament. Of course, however, this does open up plenty of people to be able to work in such things like maybe the rural industry, or maybe looking very far down the line, this opens up for people to work in the industrial revolution or industry, because considering that most land was bought out at least by 1815, this is sort of getting into the industrial revolution, and people always have that to turn to as well. So overall, working on the land, the general conclusion you want to know is that agriculture before the 17th century was suffering because of climate problems and issues, and as a result, people were malnourished, so they were, suffering too from like plague and everything. Over time, though, with improvements in agriculture, agriculture allowed for more food, whether on the side of vegetables or in the livestock and cattle, as I mentioned before. More food equals more people. That's just a simple equation in terms of like social sciences and such. But in some places, despite these upbringings and these better improvements in farming, some people, mostly the peasantry in particular, were getting a short end of the stick because they were losing their farmland to be able to work with through stuff like enclosures, which creates a larger and unemployed lower class. So there's definitely positive and negatives on the both ends of the spectrum, although a lot of these ideas will work into the population explosion, which my associate Victor Pina will be getting into after I'm finished right now. So I'll see you guys around. Bye.
Alright, jumping into the population explosion, we're going to look at these essential questions to think about during the duration of this part of the PowerPoint. So what factors caused Europe's population to remain relatively stagnant before the 18th century? So basically, why didn't you see a drastic increase in population throughout the ages in Europe? Also, why did the 18th century bring about a rapid increase in population? So what made this century so special? So we're going to look at population growth before 1700. Population growth in Europe was relatively slow and irregular during this time period. The population would grow slowly until a tragedy, such as the plague, that's the most obvious example, struck, and then the following years would be spent trying to bring the population back up to the point where it was before the disaster struck. So as an example, the growth averaged about 0.5% to 1% in the 17th century. So this is relatively slow, but your population would double after 70 to 140 years, which is semi-respectable. The problem is Europe wouldn't have a straight 70 to 140 years without any war, famine, or diseases striking, so the population wasn't able to just rise. So if we look here, at about 1335, you can see where the Black Death strikes, and your population drops drastically. We're looking at this red line here. And then it takes about 300 years before your population actually reaches the levels it was at before the Black Death, so you can see how drastic of an impact diseases had on the population. So now let's jump into population deterrents like disease, famine, and war. So famine caused people to become malnourished. In 1500 in particular, it was a point where the population surpassed the agricultural production. So food prices would increase, people now can't afford food, and they become malnourished, which adds on top of the malnourishment Connor already mentioned. And when at this point, it was people were very susceptible to diseases, so now if a disease came that maybe wouldn't have killed too many people, their immune systems could have fought it off. Now it was quite devastating. Then on top of this, you have war killing people for the obvious reason of soldiers killing each other on the battlefield, but other reasons you might not have thought about, where when soldiers needed food and they're going through the countryside, they would stop at farmers' houses, get food from them, which then depletes part of the farmers' food supplies. And then when farmers go to them, it actually spreads diseases to these farmers, so then farmers can become sick and die, their families can become sick and die. And that was quite problematic. And then during battles that they would have, they may destroy the crops in the farmlands. So if you look at the 30 Years' War, in some German states, some large areas saw a decrease of their population of up to 2/3, which is really quite dramatic. Now we can see here how famine and disease, they really work together during this time period to kill a lot of people. Now we have the population explosion. So this began in the 18th century. We see a small amount in the increase of birth rates. The really big thing here is the reduction of deaths. So touching on the increase in birth rates, women were now starting to work in rural industries, so they were able to marry earlier and then have more children during the duration of their marriages. And then reduction in deaths, we're going to talk about some more of these, but one really big one was the plague disappeared after 1722. So if you think back on the Black Death that killed approximately a third of Europe's entire population, which is rather devastating. So now that that's out of the picture, the population is free to rise quite more easily. Now we have famine reduction. Due to better transportation, this was provided because of absolutist monarchs making better canals and roadways. So now if a village is suffering due to a lack of food, you can now transport food in from another area and keep those people from starving, keep them better nourished and such like. Then you have the disease prevention. So the smallpox vaccine, which was actually only really effective in England, the rest of Europe didn't see it until about a century after or so. So now in England there was a woman named Mary Montagu. She really advocated for the smallpox inoculation, and she saw this in Constantinople when she was traveling with her husband, and to perform the smallpox vaccine, she describes a woman would take a needle and she would make a small incision in your arms or legs or wherever you wanted, and then she would take a small dose of a matter containing the smallpox and insert it into your veins. After about 8 days, you would start to become sick, and then after being mildly sick compared to what you would have been if you got smallpox naturally, you would then fight off the smallpox, and now are immune to it in the future. So that prevented a lot of people from dying from smallpox. Now, with the better water supply and sewage system, that helped reduce diseases like typhoid and typhus. Then with the draining of swamps, which Connor touched upon earlier, this reduced the mosquito population, and since mosquitoes played a large role in spreading diseases without a method through which to spread diseases, you helped to bring down their impact quite a bit, keep people from dying. And now new foods help to keep people alive. The potato from South America was a big one. It was more nutritious, so that helps to keep people from becoming so malnourished. So, conclusion points, things you should have seen, what are here summed up in case you missed it all. The famine caused Europeans to live in poverty, really keeping the population from being able to increase rapidly or at all in some cases. And war and diseases quickly killed off large amounts of the populace. The 18th century saw a decrease in the amount of people dying from disease due to the disappearance of the plague, the introduction of the smallpox vaccine, and the reduction of the mosquito population. Here are citations. Have a great day, everybody.